Good morning, everyone. I am here today with Barbara Brooks Kimmel. You'll recognize that name from some of the content that you will be reading in your module about trust. It is a complete honor to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Barbara today. In my healthcare leadership experience, trust has been a foundational element in many different ways. First, as myself as a leader, and those I interacted with, and how our organization was trusted by the patients of the community. So we're going to get into a little bit of that today. But first, I'm going to just read a little bit about Barbara's bio. She's the founder of Trust Across America, Trust Around the World, whose mission is to help organizations build trust. It's in its 11th year, and in that time, the program has developed proprietary trust evaluation tools, and she also runs the world's largest global trust alliance and is editor of the award-winning Trust Inc. book series, and there's a little bit of content from that book in your modules as well. She was a former consultant to McKinsey. She's worked across industries and with many Fortune 500 CEOs. So it is my honor to introduce you to Barbara, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I just wanted to say hello first and have you say hello as well.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you.
One of my favorite things to do, probably because I come from a long line of educators, is to have an opportunity to teach. So again, thanks for the opportunity. I hope that I can add some value to the conversation and the class, and I'm really glad to connect with you today.
Great, thank you so much. I guess, given as a trust module, the place to start is with the question, what is trust?
Okay, what is trust? So let me turn the question around and ask you, what do you think trust is?
Oh, well, I guess I'm going to define trust by using examples, which probably isn't the good academic answer, but trust to me is around integrity and credibility. It's about staying true to your word, knowing that you're not going to be harming people with your actions, and what you say is true, and people can trust that. So that's not a good definition if I'm using the actual word, but really it's around integrity and credibility around your word and your actions.
Right. Okay. So this is the way I normally start every trust conversation within, a classroom setting or any real workshop setting. And so what we find over and over again is that if you have 100 people in the room, you're going to get 100 different answers. So of what trust is, not how do you define it, but what it is. And you hear the same basic adjectives like integrity and respect and the things that you mentioned. But then if I say to you, or if I say to the audience, well, give me an example of a company you trust. Invariably, depending on the age of the audience, we might come up with very often, well, I really like Apple. And then the question is, well, what is it that you like about Apple? And of course, the answer is, well, Apple, I like their products. My iPhone is a good product. I like my Mac, whatever it is. And so then I'll say, well, what do you think about Tim Cook's treatment of all the workers along his supply chain?
Wow. And
so now all of a sudden, what we've done is we've put trust in a different context. And so now we're going to start really thinking about, well, can you just say, what is trust without some sort of context? So what we hear sometimes is trust in banking is up, trust in banking is down, trust in leadership is up, trust in leadership. Trust to do what? In other words, so unless we really hone in on what we're talking about, it's really hard to say what trust is. And so very similar to you, we stopped trying to define it. And what we do instead is we describe it. Because for us, trust is an outcome. And it's an outcome of principled behavior. And so what I mean by that is it's not one size fits all. Trust is interpersonal. it takes at least 2 people. And within the team or the organization, there's certain behaviors. We have 12 of them in our model that either break trust, weaken trust, or build trust. So in order to really get to the heart of what trust is, you have to look at how these behaviors are manifesting themselves within your team or within the organization. And they're not always the same. From one team to the next within the same organization, they may be different. So basically, again, we describe trust, not define it, as the outcome of principled behavior.
Wow. I like that. And that gives me some food for thought, because I think trust is one of the standard questions in most employee engagement surveys. Do you trust senior leadership? Do you trust your leader? Something to that end. And as you're speaking, we don't take that further to articulate what trust is meaning to the person filling and completing out the survey, and then how senior leaders interpret the results from the survey. So there's no true unpacking of that. And most of the time, that score is on the low end and needs to be understood. And yet we're not talking about what you've just described as to trust being an outcome of principled behavior and values-based behavior. So that just, for me, that's something I need to do some further work on, because there is a lot of focus on it in healthcare organizations, in organizations for employee engagement scores, and yet we're really not getting to the meat of it in the way.
And you know what? If you break it down into its behavioral components, it's much less threatening.
Right.
Because what we see, and we'll get into this a little later in the interview, that most of the major trust issues are not character-based.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually communication and consistency based. And those are very easy to fix, easier than character-based issues.
Absolutely. Apples and oranges, I would think, for sure. Right. Well, that is super helpful. And thank you for providing a deeper context to the question of what is trust. And that gives me really helpful food for thought. And I think that provides some students an interesting perspective as they move forward as emerging leaders in a career, to kind of look at that a little bit differently and approach that differently as they look at engagement scores or any type of survey tool that does somehow try to get a metric on trust. What you're talking about is a little different and deeper and richer.
And again, just to put this in context with another story, I asked a senior leader, second in command at a major international health insurance company, whether he thought his company was trustworthy. And his answer was emphatically yes. And I said, well, why? And he said, because we are expanding internationally and growing our revenues every quarter. And so that was his context on what trust was. Now, I said thank you. And then I went over to Indeed or Glassdoor and read the employee reviews. And there was such a disconnect between his understanding of what trust meant and how the employees viewed the organization that they worked for.
Yeah, I think that is such an important element from a leadership trait perspective. And in your experience, what organizations have you seen kind of bridge that disconnect as best as possible that's been successful to kind of build on that trust? Have you seen a common trend or theme with leaders who are interested in understanding what trust really looks like, what it means to employees, and then how do they really get a good sense or handle on that for their organizations?
So to answer your question, we see certain industry. So let's talk about public companies first. Generally speaking, public companies in the United States are very I won't say trust averse, but it's very difficult to build trustworthy organizations because there's too many competing demands from shareholders, from regulators, from just CEO tenure, things that, you know, quarterly earnings. There's too many things that really are not trust friendly within public companies. And so we also tend to see certain industries like healthcare, like banking, that are just inherently, and again, we have another model, which I don't want to discuss today, but we actually measure the trustworthiness of public companies. And so we see entire industries that have maintained relatively low trust over the years, and they haven't really tried to improve because they can't. There's too many competing interests, and also because they're inherently not trustworthy industries. There's too much incentivized, whatever it is, whether it's incentivized selling or whatever, that just prohibits them. And again, think Wells Fargo as a perfect example. However, what we do find is once we get into a smaller private company, there we can make some headway, and doesn't necessarily, it's not industry specific. What it is leadership specific. And so if we have a leader who's principled, or a leader who's ethical, or a leader who actually wants to proactively look at trust instead of reactively, because that's where most of the trust work is reactive, not proactive. But a proactive leader, you know, in any industry who wants to build trust in as an intentional strategy into what they do is so far ahead of their peers that it's going to take them, you know, profitability, employee engagement, you know, you name it, you know, training, innovation, all those things that really come from a high trust level of trust. Not sure if that answers your question, but you know, it's not industry specific per se.
Correct. And I think it touches on what you indicated, which is it starts with the leader themselves and their interests.
Always starts. Now, that's not to say, and I've had this conversation so many times with middle management, you can definitely make strides within your own team. The problem is when the team looks up the ladder, that's where then you have to keep them really focused, like we're just doing what we do. But if they really, you know, if they care about the perception of the organization, that only will take you so far in middle management. Because if they look up the chain and the CEO is, I don't know, you know, accepting bribes or whatever, I think it's not really gonna, you know, it's not going to extend. It's not going to be permanent.
Agreed. And you know, for leaders, as they go through the career, they're going to have to assess for themselves what is trust mean to them. How do they want to show up from a principles and values based perspective, and then align themselves accordingly. And I think every leader in the career has to make a decision. Do you continue to work with an organization that doesn't align with your values, you know, or you stay and make as much difference as possible, realizing some of the constraints. And if you feel that that isn't a long-term solution, you know, there's always a different decision to be made. And I think all of us as leaders have had many interactions and reflection to have to kind of evaluate our role in an organization that doesn't necessarily align with who we are as leaders or as individuals. So I'm gonna maybe, I know you've done extensive research and we've included some literature in the modules. Certainly we won't have the time today to go through, you know, all of the different traits and values of a trustworthy leader. If you could highlight in your experience in research, perhaps maybe what you would think is the top 2 or 3 leadership traits leadership traits that a trustworthy leader has.
Okay, so I think that leadership traits can be broken. We break them down into 3 generic categories, and we didn't come up with these categories. We didn't develop them. I just saw them one day and I said, well, this kind of fits where we're going with this thing. And again, I can give you definitions if you want, but they're basically, I think, pretty understandable. You know, they're really character, competence, and consistency. And so if you look at the behaviors, they normally will fit into, sometimes they cross over into 2, but they'll fit into at least one of those categories. And so again, what I alluded to earlier is that most of when we do the work that we do, we don't really necessarily see the character as being one of the top 3 traits that are breaking trust. We don't see the character components. Occasionally, we'll see respect
Mhm.
coming up in the top 3, and we've seen that in certain kinds of teams where you would expect there to be a respect issue. So, but putting that aside for a minute, the top 2 that we normally see that are the weaknesses, and we've seen those in our general survey, which you can go to our website and take anytime, it's free. And it'll show you, we have over 500 respondents now, so you can see at the end how your answers compare to all these other people. The top 2 are behavioral, because the third one is not behavioral, but the top 2 behavioral ones are accountability
Mm.
and transparency. And so those 2 are not that hard. I mean, there's resources available that will, that will guide any team or organization in fixing those, or at least putting you on the right track to get you there to be more accountable, either as an individual, as a team, or as a leader. And the same goes with transparency. Many leaders are afraid to be transparent, but the truth is that employees want to hear the truth.
Yeah.
And they're more resilient than a lot of leaders think they are. So while leaders may have been advised by, I don't know, probably their legal team to not be transparent, there's a certain trust benefit, obviously, that comes with transparency. And that's not to say that you betray confidences or anything like that, but transparency should really be given a little bit more attention, the same as accountability. And again, if the leader is talking, but he's not walking,
Yes.
then obviously, we need to go back to square one.
Agreed.
Or
Oh,
did they say not as I do, or whatever it is.
absolutely agree. And, as our emerging leaders move throughout their career, understanding where they sit from a values-based perspective, how they show up, hold themselves accountable, and how consistent they are in terms of their responses in engagement, and then how they are transparent to the extent that they can be with their team members. I think is something that will serve them well in their careers. And we've built into the curriculum is self-awareness type tools, and taking a look from emotional intelligence perspective, which kind of all intertwine to help give our emerging leaders the awareness and skill set with respect to really reflecting on how you show up in these key traits and skills so that they can be trustworthy leader and an effective leader as they try to navigate leadership in the healthcare environment. And so I want to turn it over to healthcare specifically. Trust looks varied in a stakeholder perspective in the healthcare industry. So, I'll list off a couple of stakeholders in terms of where trust is really key, and we can't get into all of them today, but just to kind of help frame the trust elements in stakeholder relationships. So in my experience, I've had some challenges, and I know how important trust is to the community in which the hospital or healthcare organization is serving. Patients want to trust the organization, the hospital, and their healthcare providers. Healthcare providers want to trust each other, whether that's the physicians with nursing or other health professionals. Health professionals want to trust each other when they're providing care, and that could be within the skill group that they're in. And then they want to trust their leaders as well, and leaders want to trust them. And so the trust conundrum begins. So I'm really interested in your experience. I do know that Kouzes and Posner was listed, their quote was listed in the inside cover of Trust Inc., which to me was a really good sign that you have some experience, which I know you do, in the healthcare environment. So I'm curious as to just your thoughts about healthcare leadership and trust, and your experience, what's worked well, and perhaps some things that could be improved upon.
So again, let me start by saying that regardless of the industry, I believe that trust is always built from the top down and the inside out. And while that may sound a little bit cliche, you have to, if you break that down and think about it, what we see in healthcare, at least where I am right now, is a very big emphasis on hospital patient surveys, so to speak. So the patient gets out of the hospital wants to know, they send a survey out immediately. What does the patient think? And again, it's really, I believe, I don't want to call it a check the box practice, but it's probably a check the box practice.
It is.
So what we did, and I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier, we actually pulled a team of our Trust Alliance members together in a really informal way to have several conversations earlier in the year about trust in healthcare. And so members of the team came from strategic leadership, pharmaceuticals, compliance, really crossed over corporate social responsibility, crossed over a whole bunch of different silos that all come together. And in the first, and there was a medical doctor too, who runs a big association, who was on the calls. And what we found out really early on in our first call is that we can't even begin to talk about this until we break down what we mean by trust. Again, going back to the beginning of the conversation. And so, some of the, like you mentioned, the relationships, it's about, so what's the relationship between the head of the hospital and the medical staff? What's the relationship between the board of directors and the C-suite? Is this a for-profit or a not-for-profit? What are their values? How do the doctors treat the nurses? How do the doctors treat the patients? What's the role of pharmaceutical companies in their relationship to the doctors and prescribe? And so what we found very early on is we couldn't even begin unless we could pick a thing, a team, an interaction, because trust is interpersonal. We couldn't even begin to start chipping away at the problems with trust in healthcare. At the beginning of this pandemic, one of our alliance members got involved in a bioethics committee in the state of New Jersey to try to decide, this was at the beginning of the pandemic when hospitals were flooded with patients, who gets saved, assuming there's a shortage of beds, who gets saved and who doesn't. In other words, when they go in the front door, who goes to the left and who goes to the right.
Yeah.
So, you'd start talking about the bioethics involved in healthcare and trust, and that's a whole different story as well. So I don't mean to be avoiding your question, but unless you say trust to do what, who are you asking to do what with trust? Then you can start to make a little bit of headway.
I agree. And I think that is the lesson to be learned today, is that until you define it and define it clearly, then you can't really make any headway with improving the nebulous trust issues that are emerging. And to me, that's a takeaway for myself personally, given my own experience on organizational culture. So that in itself is a significant learning and a gift. And I guess I'll define it for the role of a healthcare leader. I'm going to just say maybe a middle manager, maybe a frontline manager of a unit or a team, in the corporate space, environmental services workers, the laundry unit, et cetera. In your experience, is there, maybe one or two things, and maybe it is as similar as the answer you provided already around transparency and consistency and respect, but is there one or two things that you see within a big organization where a middle manager can do the best that they can to maintain trust between themselves and their employees?
Yeah, it's so easy. The solution is so simple that it's embarrassing. Have a discussion about it.
Yes.
With your team. In other words, instead of taking it for granted.
Yes.
Or not acknowledging it or shoving it under the rug, just like a lot we do in our personal lives. Frame a discussion. I'm not saying to sit down with your team and say, okay, let's talk about trust. Let's talk about this component of trust, or let's survey our team in a very non-threatening way to see where trust is breaking down. And so let's say it's accountability. That's a heck of a lot less threatening and frightening for a team leader to address than this big trust word in the room.
Yes.
So let's talk about it. Let's find a way to start the conversation. Let's use a few little simple tools to get together at lunch, have a team meeting or whatever, and talk about it.
That's incredible. Incredible practical advice. And yes, it sounds simple, and it is simple, yet the application sometimes is not as easy to do. And there's a skill set for leaders to feel comfortable to do that and be equipped with this.
It's very threatening if you look at the word trust itself. And that's why we broke it down into behaviors.
Yes.
We can talk about transparency, never mention the word trust. But if we can build transparency, then what we're doing, the outcome is going to be all the more stronger, because the weakest link is always going to break the chain.
Yeah.
So whatever it is, if you have somebody who's not telling the truth, it's going to break the trust chain.
Absolutely. So I want to pick up on something you referenced earlier, and it's something I've had personal experience with, which is the notion of rebuilding trust through a crisis. So in the healthcare environment and healthcare leadership specifically, managers and leaders typically are navigating a crisis at some frequent level. The nature and the extent of the crisis varies, and yet there's always a crisis to navigate through. In healthcare in Ontario specifically, there seems to be a bit more visibility to breaches of trust in an organization and issues. So there are a lot of elements that shine light on issues that hit the media. So healthcare leaders have to navigate that as well. But for the purposes of our conversation today, can you talk to me about what your thoughts are about rebuilding trust through a crisis? And I have had some insight in some of your work around the notion of rebuilding trust. So I want to unpack that, because when I read an article you had wrote recently, it gave me new insight into the notion of rebuilding trust. So if you could elaborate for our students, I'd appreciate it.
So one day I came to this revelation that you can't, and I thought about like a house. If your house gets blown down in a hurricane, you can rebuild it if the foundation, and you don't need to put a new foundation in if the foundation is still strong. So it's the same thing with trust in a crisis. You can't rebuild something that never existed. So if you had a strong foundation of trust before the crisis, the fallout from the crisis is going to be minimized. And again, think Johnson & Johnson and Tylenol, many years ago. They came through that crisis pretty unscathed. You can go back and look at their corporate credo. And again, this was many years ago. Things have changed. They followed their credo. They never really apologized per se. They never used an apology, but they were able to recover because they owned the problem and they successfully navigated out of it. Probably because they had the trust of many of their stakeholders beforehand. So let's talk about, and again, getting away from healthcare for a minute, let's just talk about our pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has created a crisis of trust, primarily among managers and their employees. Mm-hmm. Because what we saw before with employee engagement numbers in the low 30s, according to Gallup, for years, mm-hmm. there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of trust before the pandemic.
Agreed.
Now, all of a sudden, micromanagers, which many of them are, had their, quote, power taken away as their employees started working remotely and they didn't know how they were spending their days.
Oh, geez. Yes.
Okay. Right?
Yes.
So instead of saying, okay, let's have a trust discussion, what they did is they turned to surveillance software. So, when you say navigating your way out of a trust crisis, it depends who you call to help you.
Yeah.
So if you call the surveillance software folks who are getting a lot of publicity these days, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to put that little green light, blinking light on every employee's computer, and I'll know exactly how they're spending every minute of their day.
Yep.
And someone thinks that that's the way to build trust.
Yep. Yes. I'm seeing that with clients
Right?
I'm working with currently. They don't trust what the employees are doing and feel they need some productivity tools and insight. And
What did they do before this to build trust with their employees?
yeah, I think there's a notion you have visibility or they're in your physical space that somehow that felt more trusting. And then now when they're not, there's a fear. And then the fear is driving the fact that they think they're watching Netflix all day or doing whatever.
Maybe
Is the outcomes being achieved? Like there's other ways to kind of approach the question.
but you can't, I mean, you can't regulate trust. So
No.
the fact that, I mean, I worked in an organization for several years where there were people within the company who did their darndest every day to see just how little they could work. They were getting paid. And because leadership was so toxic, their goal was to work as little as possible.
Yes, I could see
And
that.
collect a paycheck. And so, I don't know, that really again comes back to trustworthy leadership. And you can't have any expectations of any of your employees if you didn't do the work before the crisis.
I absolutely agree. And being a leader who has come into repair or repair culture, we'll call it culture renewal with a focus on repairing trust, an organization where I did not have responsibility in what happened to break down trust, if it even existed, to your point earlier. And so I'm curious for other leaders experiencing having to build trust, we'll call it that, when they're new after a crisis has happened or even throughout the crisis, are the tools and techniques to be a trustworthy leader the same as building and establishing trust after a crisis, or is there anything new or different that a leader needs to think about as they try to restore, build trust as a crisis is occurring or after?
That's a big question. I think, and again, I don't mean to sound evasive, but I think, first of all, it depends on what the crisis is.
For sure.
What caused the crisis? If you have, okay, so let's use McDonald's as an example. I don't know if you're aware that recently the McDonald's CEO had to step down because he was, it was found that he was violated the, whatever you want to call it, the sexual conduct rule within his own company. Now, then they found out after and he took the head of HR as well with him, because it was determined that the head of HR, I guess, knew some of what was going on within the organization, but also kept that quiet.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a very different problem than, or a very different trust and ethics issue than perhaps Carnival Cruise Line's ship several years ago, when I think it, was in an accident off the coast of Europe or something like that. In other words, that's a whole different kind of crisis.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, to answer your question, you really have to say, trust to do what? What was the crisis? Was it a crisis of ethics that precipitated the crisis? Was it a crisis, just a natural disaster? Because each one of these requires a different skill set for the leader to back themselves out of it. What we see in the big companies is the leader usually tiptoes off into the sunset.
Yes.
And that's how the crisis is handled. And we see that over and over again. That seems to be standard operating procedure. When I read the McDonald's case, what I thought was interesting was that it seemed like there's something else called the rogue employee. Blame the rogue employee, which is very often also the way a toxic leader or a toxic organization will try to get out of their crisis. In this case, it was the head of HR.
Hmm. Yes.
So I don't know if that answers your question directly.
It does actually, because the questions that have to be asked is defining, and it's to the earlier points, it's really defining what has been broken or what needs to be repaired. What is it? What is trust? And so trust will be thrown around all of the time. And it is this vague, generic term that has different meanings for different stakeholders and different individuals. So until you ask the question and try to define it and then articulate identify out of what's been defined, you can't do anything that's going to be effective in changing that outcome. So I think for leaders, for the purpose of this course, there is always going to be bumps in the road, issues and crises to navigate through. And it's taking the time after the dust settles is to truly unpack it and ask those questions. And trust, many times will be coming up as an issue. Well, trust has been broken, or trust wasn't established, or I don't trust this or that, or it's a trust issue in the brand or the quality of care. It's understanding all of that, unpacking it, defining it, and then picking out the 2 or 3 things to focus in on that you can actually
have an action plan, going forward. And you can communicate that action plan instead of just saying, we're going to rebuild trust. Well,
yes.
How are you going to do that?
That is the biggest takeaway. So the last question I was going to leave with you, what is the biggest takeaway for our emerging and current leaders who are taking this module to think about as they move forward? And I have to believe it's around the understanding what trust is in the application they're trying to take some action in.
Right. So again, not the best way to do this is stop at our website, tap into trust. There's a big blue button. You'll see the behaviors. The last behavior, which is tracking, really, that's the 12th behavior, and it's not really a behavior. It says, well, is the organization tracking trust? Just like you might track profitability. Mm-hmm. So, but if you look at those 11 behaviors quietly, go down the list, think about your own relationships. Think about which behaviors, even in your personal life, which behaviors are the weakest. Lack of transparency, respect, whatever there are. There's 11 of them. Work on them personally. And then take the knowledge that you've learned about yourself and take it forward when you start working in teams and organizations with people who you may not know. But be conscious about it. Do it consciously. Don't take trust for granted. Understand the underlying behaviors that build it and the underlying behaviors that weaken it. And don't fall prey to the water cooler talk. Walk away from it.
I agree. That's so valuable. And part of the learning activity for our module is for our participants to do just that. So taking a look at those values, attributes, do that reflection and build a trust credo or value statement to lead from as they go forward. So for me, that is one of the most foundational elements any leader, specifically for this module, healthcare leaders, to do early in their careers, which will serve them well. And
don't forget to engage your team.
Yes.
Get your ownership in the development of that. Don't do it yourself.
No.
Have everyone own it.
I agree. Absolutely. Thank you. You have given me, Barbara, such insight into something that has been a significant issue in the organizations I've worked in with. And you've helped reframe a few things for me as well. So you've provided me some insight and education, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm grateful for your time today. And I'm really grateful for all of the work that you've been doing to really bring trust into the spotlight. The business case for trust and what does trustworthiness look like, and you're doing it in an evidence-based way, and really bringing awareness to something that organizations at times want to hide from. So thank you for that incredible mission. And it's been my honor to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. And as we discussed earlier, first of all, thanks for having me. But as we discussed earlier, when you said, that I was a trust expert, and I said to you, no, actually, I'm a trust student. There's something we can all learn about trust every day. And that's something to think about. Spend a couple of minutes reflecting every day about, whether you are helping to build trust or bust trust in whatever relationship, it's important to you.
Yes, I'm going to do that. And I would say that in my career, I've had a lot of focus on organizational culture, trust being a key element. And through preparation for this course and consumption of your content and our conversation today, I have a lot more work to do to continue to build my knowledge on trust and the practical applications to help leaders understand that and organizations to build it. So you've provided me great insight. So if you're a student, then I don't even know what I'll call myself. So I'm still very much in the learning of the learning processes,
Right.
and I appreciate your
We
insight.
all are. We all are.
Yes, your expertise is just a little bit up than mine. So, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
And thank you.
Thanks.